Hello, my name is Szymon Lansky, and for my bachelor's project I decided to take on a challenge and try to recreate the unique look and feel of the 2D adventure game Machinarium in Unreal Engine 5. As a big fan of the game since I was little, I was immediately drawn to its handcrafted style and its intricate designs, and wanted to create something similar. I'm generally more drawn towards characters with my projects and work, but I really wanted to do something different. I played through the game again and just couldn't stop thinking about it. So, this idea came up even before I started thinking about my final project. It felt like a right choice and an opportunity to learn something different. In this video, I'll be showcasing the steps I took to achieve this ambitious goal, including the tools and techniques I used to create the game's textures, models, and atmosphere. I will take you through the process of remaking Machinarium in 3D and the expected and unexpected challenges that came with it. The tools I use the most are Blender, ZBrush, Photoshop, Substance Painter, Substance Designer, and a bit of Substance Sampler. First, blockout and modeling techniques. Machinarium has a very distinctive hand-drawn look. I tried to capture it by sculpting certain models such as the arcade, the bridge, the right island, as well as Joseph. It needed a lot of bespoke, unique, handmade detail for it to feel connected to the original. I started with a screenshot from the game, a level called Arcade Bridge. This is my favorite level from the visual standpoint, and at the same time, it wasn't too crowded with detail. It felt like the best fit for the project. I used the knife tool to cut out the main shapes and extruded them. I set up the camera in Blender that would be close to the original angle. This really ended up helping me when matching against the original. I would extrude the cutouts and roughly place them around the scene. The projected artwork gave me a great basis. Because it was all cut out of the original image, I had a lot of hand-drawn detail still in the texture, lifted straight from the original piece. I used that to motivate my modeling and later sculpting. I used projection to enhance the shapes I roughly cut out, like the arcade itself. I made an extensive use of curve tools in Blender, especially draw curve feature, which served as an excellent basis for the ever-present tubes. Also, with the use of geometry nodes and a remesh modifier, the curve draw tool can be excellent for painting moss. Texturing and materials. I made a custom HDRI in Blender by creating a volumetric shader and shining a light through it with a separate HDRI to replicate the heavy clouds in the concepts. I didn't end up using it in the end because I could replicate similar feelings straight in Unreal Engine 5 without it being just a static image. I'm using atmospheric clouds and cranked up the density and amount to a max. I also made use of the height fog with heavy yellow tint. To replicate the interesting look of the cracked plaster in the original artwork, I sampled the texture from upscaled screenshots of the arcade bridge level. I removed shadows by hand, lightened and darkened certain spots to make it uniform. Then, I offset the texture to make it tileable by painting over it and using stamp tool. Then, I use Substance Sampler as a base to generate height, roughness, and even further deshadow the albedo. I put tessellated plane into ZBrush and applied the generated height to it. When it was in ZBrush, I flattened certain noisy parts and shrank the cracks a bit. Then, I proceeded to Substance Painter to project the height detail, color variation, edge highlights, and AO. I also experimented with texture variations such as dirty and mossy version. I didn't end up using this exact texture, but I was in a stage of experimentation, which was useful to see what would take how much time and what flexibility would each result have. Substance Designer ended up being my main tiling texture tool, mostly because of its flexibility. Using Substance Designer was fairly straightforward. I cropped the material I wanted to replicate from the original concept and focused on the detail the artist in Amanita Design chose for it. I iterated on each texture until the shapes felt right and colors fit. I didn't end up sampling the exact colors from the reference at the end, but just eyeballed it until it looked similar. I exposed a parameter that would make the textures more destroyed and more clean and played with that straight in Unreal Engine by using the Substance plugin. Unfortunately, this didn't work very well, and after some tweaking my project crashed and the textures got corrupted, so I had to export them manually. Modeling and texturing the cityscape. I needed to fill the skyline around the islands, so I went through all the screenshots I downloaded from the game. I was looking for interesting looking background buildings and material patterns. I screenshotted and cropped all the interesting detail I found and made trim sheets that would mimic it. I tried different plate and shape looks. Also, made a primitive version of a tool I will be using extensively later. Geometry Nodes Bolt Generator. In this version, the generator would instance one bolt on each vertex I would place on the top of the plates I made. This version was very simple and didn't account for the curvature of the underlying mesh. When making the trim sheets, I used array modifier to gauge how will the plates look when tiled. It also gave me the opportunity to push certain parts of the tiling square, because it would automatically push it in the next array instance, and it would tile correctly, similarly to Substance Designer. I exported a trim sheet base as a high poly, and then baked it down on a plane. I made 4 stages of decay for each trim sheet and intended on using it. I didn't end up using all of them, for performance reasons. If I were to do that with each material, it would have 4 times as many textures, which wasn't worth the effort, and drop in performance in the end. If I had more time, I might have resurrected this idea, because the textures are done and ready to use, but I would have to optimize it very heavily. Which leads me to an important point. This project was as much about what I was going to do, as much as what I wasn't going to do. You have to choose what needs to be done the most if you have a tight time frame. I cut many things out because they just weren't worth the trouble. But if I were to revive this project, I have resources to easily expand on those ideas. Also, I later added float mesh decals to my trim sheet arsenal, because sheet with windows without alpha masking proved to be way less flexible than placing it anywhere with a float mesh and transparency. I have analyzed and then modeled few buildings from the background plates. I have changed them slightly, but tried to preserve the feeling of the original art. To scatter the buildings in the background, I used the geometry node systems in Blender. To randomly distribute them on a plane I modeled around the main scene. I used this for a rough testing. I knew there was a way more performance and artist-friendly way of doing it, by using the foliage tool. I exported the same mesh I used to scatter the buildings on it in Blender, and used the foliage tool to scatter the buildings with somewhat randomized scale to it. The 2 focal points of this artwork were undeniably the 2 islands. The huge building on the right, the metal arcade tower, as well as the bridge connecting them. These parts were the most important to get right, to make the piece work. I took the projected mesh of the arcade I had made in Blender and utilized it as the foundation to sculpt on, to make sure that my sculpting was guided by the original texture. I subdivided the mesh numerous times and converted the texture to polypaint. I found this approach to be effective for bases. I realized that I needed to make a certain modification to the arcade to make it more interesting in the 3D space. Specifically, I felt that it required more depth and complexity compared to the original, which featured uniformly flat planes without much variation in depth. I tried to incorporate more details and chaos to the plates and enhancing the overall appearance of the arcade tower. I received a comment it reminded people of SpongeBob buildings, which is very true. I might have subconsciously even thought about it when sculpting. I hand sculpted all the plates. First, I have drawn the plates on the surface and then added and subtracted from the shapes with clay buildup. Foliage is a big part of the aesthetic Adolf Lachmann was going for. Even though the world feels relatively dead and barren, there are certain parts with living plants which creates a very unique contrast with the robots and wasteland all around. For that, I created the generator of moss. It works by literally drawing curves in a place where the moss would grow. Then, I would use geometry nodes based displacement and voxel remesh. Then, I used a simple box unwrap to get UVs from the moss material. I made it in Substance Designer. Also, there was some grass and dandelion leaves in the other screenshots. I knew there was a pack in the Quixel bridge I could use. I also modeled a 3 pots for plants on the back side of the arcade as a nod to a previous level. But most importantly, I wanted to fill the blank space on the back of the arcade. I have put a dandelions in them from a Quixel pack. I like the contrast. It is such an ordinary plant in our universe, but in a wasteland town of robots, it must feel really pretty. I needed tileable materials because both islands were very large for one bespoke non-tileable texture set from Painter. But it was still used as a part of the pipeline later. It was used to lighten edges and darken AO. I made numerous materials in Designer, based on materials found in the scene, and I even ended up replacing the first texture I made, the one sampled from the concept. Certain models were modeled to be very optimized, and some were not. Because of the scale of the project and fairly short time frame, certain models were kept fairly high poly for traditional game standard. However, it might not be as strange in few years with using nanite. If I were to model the arcade again, I might have segmented the plates with separate meshes and then sculpted on top of that. It would provide me with more optimized mesh and better UV space. On the other hand, it would look more manufactured and less organic and handmade, like the current one is. I knew I was going to decimate the sculpted mesh for two reasons. For one, laziness, or maybe better called, time management purposes. Because like that, I could spend way more time on sculpting and could easily update the mesh, which happened many times during the whole process. And the second reason is enough polygons for a nice and dense polypaint resolution, especially on the cavities where it was needed the most. I knew the right island had a lot of area, which couldn't be made by just one non-tiling texture. So I chose a hybrid way, using RGB polypaint for each of four materials to blend in between. Black equals bricks, red equals plaster, green equals ground, blue equals cracked plaster. Since I have set up the material very similarly in both engines, I could very easily work on it in Blender and then see almost the same result in Unreal Engine. I have hand painted all the colors, so the materials would correspond to the original. I did most of the painting in Blender, but made some adjustments in Unreal 5 afterwards. The before mentioned second UV map was to highlight edges and add AO on top. I did that by taking the whole island and using a cube projection to get basic UVs. Then, I would make seams from the generated islands and neaten them up a bit. Removed a lot of them to make the textures more continuous. Then, I used the new seams to unwrap it traditionally. Since the mesh was very complex, I had to hand sculpt the UVs to minimize visible stretching by checking the UV grid. Then, I would scale them way beyond the limits of the 1:1 UV square, so the tiling would look correctly scaled. Then, I would create an extra UV slot where I would pack all the islands into one UV square. I would use the first UV slot to drive the tiling textures, and the packed UV would go into Substance Painter, where I would bake all the maps I needed. Then, I made a simple RGB mask, with each channel being for AO, Edge Mask, and Random Grunge. This connected the building even better to the rest of the scene. I took static props that would logically stay on the island for years, so I didn't include the ladder or the welding bot, and would use it as high poly, so there would be baked AO under the cables, fuse boxes, and such. I used basically the same technique for the arcade island, but instead of RGB mask, I chose shades of grey to lerp between 4 stages of decay of the metal. It took a while to figure out the formula for it. I've written down, but then I figured out one was extra. I couldn't figure out why it wasn't 4 formulas, but just 3. I realized there were only 3 transitions, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. So the formula was actually... For the arch, I sculpted an extra sleeve over it to make the UVs fit better. In the original, the bricks were laid logically in the arch shape, which was more complicated to do with the decimated mesh. Then, I used projection on it to better follow the shape of the island. Similarly to before mentioned arcade door, I masked certain parts that would go underneath the plaster with wave painting. I sculpted the main arcade, right island, part of the bridge, as well as Robot Josef and the owl. However, The owl ended up being completely remeshed and just the shape remained. With the others, I tried sculpting the detail to bake in Substance Painter. The sculpt of the owl was just for convenience sake. It was easier to make this shape in ZBrush and then retopo it in Blender later. To add even more detail to the hand-sculpted arcade, bridge and other props, I enhanced my ball generator. This geometry node setup could now sample normal of the face laying directly underneath. Each vertex placed would append the bolt and then correctly rotate it according to the underneath surface. With combination of shrink wrap modifier, I have a very effective tool to hand place bolts without having to manually rotate them, randomize their scale, or make sure they are really sitting on the surface. One of the main points of interest in the scene is the machine inside the greenhouse. I made an IK bone system where I would lock rotation axis of the arms and parented an empty to rotating wheel. It took some tweaking, but after a while it started to look similar. I referenced the shape and the motion from the game, and when I felt it was close enough, I converted it to skeletal animation and to keyframes. I had some issues with that because Unreal didn't like the idea of more than one root bone. I ended up splitting the machine into parts. One was the arms, one was the wheel, and one was the static motor. After inspecting the level once more, I noticed that there was a piston on the very right edge I missed the first time, so I added it as well. The animation is a loop of 64 frames for one cycle of the arm rotation, and the piston goes one pump every 32 frames. But at the end, I am happy with how the motor turned out. It definitely gives the scene an interesting point of interest. Props and finishing touches. I had a rough model of all the props in the scene from beginning stages, where I cut everything out of the original image. Then I started enhancing them with a knife tool, and started reshaping them. I spent the whole day to remodel them and to set up the UVs. After that, I took all the props to Substance Painter. I was working on them in one file, with different materials. It was mostly for time's sake and consistency. Because I modeled the meshes while utilizing weight normals, I didn't have to bake high poly mesh detail in many cases, which saved me some time. I approached the island and props on it as a character. It is this organic thing that grows like a plant upwards. Everything seemed to be there for decades. It all seems connected on some level. I iterated on the textures. I updated most of the props after a while, because they didn't feel really connected to the environment. For example, I added grease stains on the welding bot, added green spots on the end of the tubes to imply algae or oxidation, or added rust spots on the sheet metal underneath the pipes and etc. I took liberties with the color palette, time of day, and some parts of the scene, such as before mentioned plates of the arcade. I tried following the lore as close as possible. The left part of the scene should be almost empty, because in the game, it's on the very edge of the city, as shown in this diagram I found. I set up a rough fly-through in a sequencer, as well as many angles I wanted to show off. Then I tweaked them until they looked right. After I felt it was finished, I took a break from looking at the results while working on the script for this video, and then further enhanced them with fresh eyes. Few corners had to be cut to fit such an ambitious project into such a short time frame, so I sacrificed a bit of performance, but the project still runs smoothly on my computer. I added many decals to break up the tiling materials even more and to better connect everything together. I introduced many of the decals from my previous group portfolio project. When I used as many of the old decals I could, I started making a mental list of decals I needed to create. I made custom rust spots and leaks, plus some mold and algae spots to replicate the feeling from the concepts. When I was listening to Machinarium soundtrack, I stumbled across a remixed version of the soundtrack with this beautiful cover art on it. I wanted to make a note to it in the final piece, so I added it as a decal that shows up for a second in the fly-through. In my creative process, I made a conscious effort to restrict myself mostly to the original art and other works by Adolf Lachmann. While some may argue that this approach could be unwise, I wanted to remain close to the distinctive atmosphere and emotion conveyed by the original piece. It was very important to me to stay close to the original concept without deviating too far from its core essence. By doing so, I was able to immerse myself in the original version better and truly capture its essence in my reinterpretation. To even more immerse myself, I tried to listen to as much of the original music from the game as possible. I believe that the emotion conveyed in the original music will help you form your art with certain feeling underlying it. Techniques from the literature review. Booleans were important for getting certain complex shapes modeled quickly, such as the circular holes in the bridge, which was then voxelized and remeshed anyway. Shrink wrap was useful for projecting the original plane on the more complex shapes, such as the cylinder, in the case of the arcade, or the brick arch sleeve. Another technique I mentioned in my research was baking RGB mask from Substance Painter to drive the blending of tileable textures. Weight normals was a great time saver too, when creating the secondary props. Baking normal detail from high poly isn't that difficult with Blender and its bevel modifier, but any time saved is time better utilized on meaningful changes. As for the planning, the screenshot outlined everything I had to create. I analyzed the concept, outlined each prop I was to recreate. I took the screenshot to Photoshop and outlined each of the props I needed and sorted them by color. Since I was approaching it very holistically, I cut out most of the pieces out of the bat and started refining them all together. The secondary props were on a lower priority right from the start because they were pretty straightforward to create, not requiring any special techniques or shaders. I used both Substance Painter and Substance Designer for different texturing styles. For props and general materials, I followed the basic workflow. I had a workflow to create a strange iron/copper hybrid that is ever present in Machinarium. There seems to be rust and copper oxidation on the same props, which evokes this strange alloy of iron and copper. I worked with most of the tiling materials in 4K, but lowered them in engine to 2K to preserve memory and better optimize the scene. At the last minute, I did few changes I want to talk about. I used an lookup table to better color correct my scene by taking a screenshot and applying filters on it in Photoshop until I was happy with the result. Then, I took a base lookup table from the internet and applied the same filters on it. Then, I put it into UE5. Here is the difference with and without. I experimented with parallax mapping as well, but didn't find much use for it, because of all the technical limitations it has. For example, the parallax would only work on one of the materials in my 4 material node tree I had for the right island. I'm sure there is a workaround for that, but I didn't have enough time to experiment with it, so I didn't end up using it for this project. Closing words. In conclusion, recreating the handcrafted 2D world of Machinarium in 3D was an ambitious and challenging task, but also a rewarding one. In my reinterpretation of the original in 3D, I incorporated several changes such as altering small details, modifying the color palette, time of the day, and drawing inspiration from other levels in Machinarium. However, I believe that I have successfully captured the essence of the original and translated it into a new medium and dimension. Through this project, I gained valuable experience in sculpting, modeling, texturing, and lighting, as well as in using various new techniques in software such as Blender and Unreal Engine 5. If I had more time, I would have expanded on the materials and would also diversify the background and focus more on optimization of the models. The most important lesson I took from this project is, it's important to choose your battles wisely and focus on what captures the attention the most first. The original is a remarkable demonstration of how to create charming, yet grungy and dirty look that evokes a sense of nostalgia. It could even be considered cute with its childish round shapes. The atmosphere of the original feels like a real location with a rich history and visible signs of age. Each corner seeps with history. It reminds me of places I have visited before, but with a bit of magic that makes it even more captivating.